Hello and welcome. I'm Dave. Today we're going to learn about NestJS Providers, and I'll provide links to all resources in the description below. I'll also provide a link for you to join my Discord server where you can discuss web development with other students, and you can ask questions that I can answer and receive help from other viewers too. I look forward to seeing you there. This tutorial is lesson 3 of a NestJS series, and today's starting code is the completed source code from lesson 2. If you haven't watched the previous lesson, there's a link to the playlist for this series in the video description, and I recommend you start at the beginning of the series as each lesson will build on the ones before it. Now, we previously used the CLI to create our files, so just as a quick review, we're going to work on a provider today, and we would create that provider by typing NestJS service and then the provider name, and we're creating a users provider, so we would type users. Now, we already have that in our code from a previous lesson, but I just wanted to recap that if you need to create a provider today. So let me go ahead and delete that, and let's go to our source folder, not the package.json here, where I have changed this to lesson 3. And now in the source folder, we'll find the users directory, and in here we have our module, and we have the controller that we worked on in the last lesson. And now today, for the routes that we have in the controller, we need to create methods inside of a service that hold the logic, and then we'll inject that service back into this controller before we're finished. And we can see in our module that we have our provider right here, and we've imported the user service. And so we're using that user service in our provider slot here. Now, if we come over here to the users.service that was created with that command line I just showed you, you can see we have a very empty file right now that just has the basics of a provider service. So what we have is import injectable from Nest Common, then we have the injectable decorator at the top, and then we have an empty class named user service. Now, we'll build this in just a second, but let's take a look at the docs about providers. Now, like modules and controllers, providers are a fundamental concept in Nest. Now, why do we create a service when we're talking about providers? Well, a provider doesn't have to be a service, but it often is. So it says Nest classes may be treated as a provider, which can be services, repositories, factories, helpers, and so on. So they're not just limited to creating services, although that is often what we will do. Now, the main idea of a provider is that it can be injected as a dependency, and we're going to come back to more about dependency injection after we create our provider and we want to inject it into our controller. It basically means objects can have various relationships with each other, as they say here, so we're going to create some logic in our service that can be injected and then used in the controller. So let's go back now to VS Code and create our service. We're back in VS Code, and now let's notice this injectable decorator that we have here at the top. Now, what that does is attach metadata that declares this class that we're about to create, our user service class, can be managed by Nest, and we'll see how that works when we inject that into the controller. So now let's start out by creating our class, and we're going to start with a property to begin. I'm going to say private, and then I'm going to create a user's property. And now for this property, I'm just going to set some data, as we're not connecting a database today, but we want to have some data to work with. So I just posted in an array here, or pasted in an array of 5 user objects. You can see they each have an ID, name, email, and role. So that is a property inside this user service class. So we said private users, and we set that property. Now we're ready to create some methods inside of our service. Now, typically we name the methods after the routes that we have in the controller. So let's look at the controller quickly. We can see we have a find all for our get route. We also have a find one. So we want both of those as methods as well. Then we have a create, update, and a delete. So we will be creating 5 methods that match all of these, of course, that come after the HTTP method of get for the first 2, then post, patch, and delete. So let's go back to the service file once again, and now let's create those methods. So the first one is find all, And now it had an optional role, and we'll want to indicate that here as well. So here's the optional role. And then we had an intern role that was possible. We also had an engineer role, if I could spell that correctly, and then admin. So any one of these are a possibility for the role value in find all. After that, let's go ahead and create what goes inside the method. And the first thing we want to do is check to see if a role was passed. So we'll say if role, then we'll handle that differently. So now we'll say return, and we'll say this.users. So that refers to our users above, the users property, and it's an array, so we can filter that. And now we would only return the users with the role that was specified. So here we would say user in our filter, which is a higher order array method. And then we'll say user.role, and we want it to match whatever role was passed in. So this would only return the users that have the role that was passed in. Now, if no role was passed, then underneath we can just return all users, and we would do that with return this.users. Now that completes our find all method. Let's go ahead and scroll just a little bit more. Let's create the find one method. Now it's going to come in with an ID. This ID is going to be a number when this method receives it. So inside of this now, we'll say const user. We'll set this equal to this dot users. Now we will find instead of filter. Once again, have user here, as this is another array method. And now we'll take the user ID needs to match the ID number. Now, after we have that, we can just return the user. Okay, let's scroll for a little more room, as our create method will take up just a little more space. So we'll start with create, and now this is going to receive a user. Now this would be an object. Here we need to specify what's in the user object. In the past, we just had an empty object when we created our controller routes. Now I'm going to say the user that we create is going to need a name, which is a string. We're going to need an email, which is a string, and it's going to need a role. Now that role is specific, so it needs to be either an intern or engineer, or it could possibly be an admin user. Spell that correctly also. Once I have all three of those in, it looks like we're finished. I'm going to press Alt-Z to wrap that down now. So we've got the possibilities here for a new user. And now, of course, an ID will need to be created. Now, we're not connected to a database, where a database would typically auto-generate that ID. So let's put in just a little bit of logic to create that ID. So I'm going to say const and then users by highest ID. I'm going to set this equal to, and I don't want to sort the actual users property that we have inside of our class. So I'm going to create a new array. I'm going to pass in this dot users. And now after that, I want to sort the array, and I'm going to have an A and a B here, as I typically would with a sort function. And then I'm going to take the b.id, which is a number, minus the a.id. So this should give us an array here of users by highest ID. Once we have that, I'm going to define a new user, and I'm going to take an ID here and generate a new one. So I'm going to have an ID that I'm going to add to this user that we received that has a name, email, and role. And this ID is going to be equal to users by highest ID. We'll take the first element and then the ID property, and then we'll add 1 to it. So we're generating the next highest ID. The new person that is added will have a higher ID. And after that, we'll spread in the rest of the user that we received. So that is our new user. All of that's just to generate that ID that is already not in the data, or not already in the data, I should say. So now we'll have this.users.push, and we'll push in that new user to the array. Then we just want to return new user. And that's all we should need for our create method. Now let's scroll for some more room again, but I don't want to scroll this off of the top because I'll use just a little bit of that. So I'm going to say update. And now once again, this needs to receive an ID, so we know what user to update. So this would be an ID of number, and then we'll call this updated user. Now this would be an object here, And this is going to receive the same information we would with any other user. We can't update the ID, but we could these other three properties of the object. So I'm going to put in that same information here for the types. However, we don't have to update all three of these, so they should all be optional. So we'll put in the question mark to make each one of them optional as well. So after name, email, and role, they're all optional for the update method. Now, inside of this update method, we're going to map over the users. So I'll say this.users equals, and now I'll have this.users.map. Now I'll have a user here. And after that, I'm going to go ahead and put in another bracket here. So we're going to have to use a return. It's not a one-liner. We'll say if user.id equals the ID that is passed into our method, then we're going to return, we'll spread in the user, and then we'll spread in the updated user as well. So what this will do is spread in all of the properties of the existing user, and then the updated user will just overwrite whatever property it contains. So it comes after the user. Okay, after we do that, otherwise, underneath here, we'll just say return user. Actually, that's not otherwise. That should still be part of this.users equals. Then so we end up returning the user, I guess, if it didn't match here. So this.user still contains all of the users. Now, at the bottom of this, we're going to say return this.findOne. So we're going to call another method inside of our class, and we'll pass that ID, because after we've updated all of the users, we only want to return the updated user. And so we just use the findOne method. And finally, we have our delete method. So I will now, let me make sure we've completed this correctly. Yes. So now I'll scroll up here for more room, and we'll create the delete method that is going to receive an ID only, which is a number. And inside of this method, we will define our removed user. Set this equal to this.findOne, and we'll pass in the ID that we get. So we need this removed user defined separately, so we can hold it in that variable. Then we'll take this.users, we'll set this equal to this.users.filter, and we'll remove the user that needs removed. So user.id not equal to the ID that's passed in. So that will exclude that user that needs to be removed and will no longer be in this user. So we couldn't use findOne at this point. We needed to save the removed user up here instead of trying to use the findOne method like we did with update. So now we will just return removed user. That finishes our methods and completes our users service class. So we have all 5 methods, plus we have a property that has our beginning data here with the 5 users in it. Now with the service complete, let's look at the module. We can see we imported the user service when when the service was created into the module, and it's listed here with the provider. So we're going to need to import the user service into the controller now as well. So let's scroll to the top of the controller. I'll press Alt-Z to wrap anything down that needs to be. Now I'll say import. We'll import the user's service, and it comes from our ./users.service file that we have over here. Now, once we've done that, we need to go ahead and inject it into the controller. So let's go back to the docs quickly to discuss dependency injection just a little more. We're back in the docs, and what I want to highlight is this sentence right here where it says, in the example below, Nest will resolve the cat service, which they're giving an example of a cat's service, not a user service. It says by creating and returning an instance of the cat service, or in the normal case of a singleton, returning the existing instance if it's already been created elsewhere. Now that's a strong point for that. So what this does is it creates and returns an instance, and we do that with a constructor here. So constructor private cat service, and then we list our cat service that we created. So we're going to do that with users. But what's important to highlight is it's better than if we just created a new user service or new cat service like we typically would in code, because if it's already created elsewhere, it's a singleton, and NestJS knows that, and it returns the existing instance. So that's an important benefit here from NestJS. Let's go back and add this to our code. We're back in VS Code, and let's go ahead and add this instance now of our service to our controller. We're injecting it into that, and we do that with Constructor, and then we'll say private, and then we'll also say read only, and then we'll add users service, and then we'll list the users service that we created. And as we read in the docs, that actually creates a instance of that user service. We also need the little curly braces out here, and they're just empty, but we need those out here so we don't see all the red squigglies that you saw in my code before that. Now, again, this, of course, if it was created elsewhere, another instance, it pulls it in because NestJS identifies that it's a singleton, and that's what they call that when you've only got an object that can be created once like that. But if we were to have to create this without the NestJS benefit, we would do something like const users service equals new users service. And you may have seen that in your JavaScript code before. Of course, it's giving me an error here because we already have it there. But this is essentially NestJS is handling this line for us, but it's doing a little bit more than that. It's also saying, hey, if we created this elsewhere, it's going to find that and pull it in. So we need that at the top, and now we can use our user service inside of these routes. So let's go ahead and update our routes. And so now instead of the return with an empty array here, all we need to do is say this.userService.findAll. See, I'm calling a method, and I'm passing in a role if it was received. And that's all we need here for our find all in this get route. Now, after that, we can update our find one. Now, this is going to be just a little different as well. So let's go ahead and remove that, and we'll say return. This would be this.userService.findOne, not find all. And now inside of this, we would pass in the ID. But notice we have a problem here. The ID has a red squiggly because we're receiving an ID as a string. And that's how it's going to be sent because it's a param. All params are strings. We can't change that. So we need to convert this to handle a number, which is what our find one method expects. We could use the number constructor or parse int, but we could also use a unary, and we'll do that simply by adding a plus in front. Now let's quickly look at the MDN docs on a unary. We're in the MDN docs, and I'm looking at a unary plus. Now this is just an easy way to convert something to a number. It doesn't document itself as well as, say, parse int, so you may prefer that. However, you can just add the plus, and it's well documented here, and it's a very quick and easy way to do that, and you'll find that a lot in NestJS, even when it generates a REST API for us, and I'll show you how to do that in a future tutorial. But I just wanted you to know what the unary plus was for if you hadn't seen it. Now back to our code. Back in VS Code, I'm quickly going to jump to the delete in our controller before we get to the create and update. So now here in the delete, we're once again receiving a string for the ID, and we're going to return this.userService.delete, and this would once again receive the ID, and it once again needs the unary plus to be converted into a number. So now let's go to the create and the update, and they just need a little bit more work because our type here still currently an empty object. So we're going to have to make that match the methods that we have back in the user. So to do that, I'm just going to go back here to the user service that we have, scroll down to the create, and now we have a type here that has the name and an email, both strings, and then it has the possible values for role. So I'm going to copy that type, come back to the controller, and now I'm going to put that inside of create method here instead of that empty object. Now, of course, you might be thinking, now we've had to put that same definition in two places. It might be better to have a place where we put that definition once, and we will do that in the next video. I'm going to complete this first, and then we'll talk about what all we will cover in the next video. So here we've got the create method, and we should be receiving a body that has a user and that user's information, and it needs to match that. And of course, we're not validating that yet either. That's also something that will happen in the next video. Right now, we're just going to return, and this would be this.userService.create. And now that the types match, we could pass in user. And of course, if the type didn't match, we would have a red squiggly under user. Now we need to do the same thing for our update here in the patch route or the patch method, and then it calls update. So here, let's go back to the users.service, go to the update, and we'll get this type here. And remember, all of these were optional was the difference. Come back to the controller, and now our user update type, paste that in as well. And now when we return here, we're going to return this .users service.update. Now it needs the ID, which needs to be a number. So again, plus ID because it comes in as a string. And then it also needs the user update that we pass in. And now it looks good. With the changes to our controller now complete, well, let's go ahead and start our dev server and test these endpoints out before we finish. So control backtick to open the terminal. Now notice I am in the parent directory for the NestJS series over here. I never went directly into the lesson 3 folder, which is probably where you are, directly in your project folder. So I'm going to cd into lesson 03, and now I'm in the project folder for this lesson. And that's of course where we can start our dev server. So you're probably in there already. You could just type npm run start : dev to start up the NestJS dev server here. And let's get it all running. Before we test it out, there, everything is running as expected. Let's close that. And now I'm going to use Thunder Client. You could use Postman or any other software you want to test the endpoints. I'll open Thunder Client here, create a new request. And for that request, we need to go to http://localhost 3000, and we're running this at /users. I don't want a space at the end. I just want it like that. And now I'm going to send the request, and we should get all of our users back. Here's all 5 users. I'll pull this up so we can see the results a little bit better. But that's what we had in that property in our services class for our starting data, just those 5 users. Now let's say we just want to get user with the ID of 2. We put that param in the URL and send. Here we've got the user with ID of 2. Now let's create a new user. We'll go to the body here. I'm going to create an object, and now we should be able to send some information. So I'm going to send name, and we'll say that is, it needs to be a string there as well, Dave. And then we had email, and for email we'll say dave@davegray.codes. And from there, let's go ahead and say role. And of course, I need to be an admin, and we'll close out our object there. That's our body that we're sending now, and we'll send that to the post. Let's see if this works. Oh, also, it's not going to post /2. It once again just needs to go to localhost 3000 /users, our main endpoint. Let's see what happens. And we had 201 created, and we got that information back. Here is ID of 3. So ID of 3, I don't know if I like that. Let me go ahead and check that services just to see what happened, because we already had 5 users. So let's see our ID up here. Maybe I'd put myself in here. No, Clementine was there. So let's go back and see what we've got here. Create, let's look at this, bring this in. We create the highest ID. Oh, the sort has an equals here. This should be a minus. We wanted to say b.id minus a.id. There is the issue. So now let's see if our server restarted. Hopefully it did here. I think so. Yep, it restarted. So that once again should reset those properties that we have, those user properties. So now let's go ahead and put a GET request back in just to make sure we only get 5 users. So there's 1, 2, 3 is Clementine as expected, 4, 5. Good deal. Now let's go back to our post. Now that we have fixed that, we're going to send in this user. Might be a little bit easier to read if we put this on new line for each one here. So we've got a user named Dave, email, and a role, and that on a new line. Also, did I get rid of it by mistake? Afraid I did. There we go. Let's go ahead and send this to the post request at localhost 3000 users. Send. Oh, now I've got a bad request because I do have an extra token in there. Let me get rid of that. It's down. Yeah, extra token. Let's try it one more time. This looks correct. Send. Okay, now user ID of 6. That's what I expected because we added a new user. It counted up, got the highest ID. Here's that information of the new user. Now, while we have our server still running and we haven't made any changes, so it didn't restart, let's request all users again. Now we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So our new user has been added to the users that we have there inside of the user's property. That's what we wanted. Now let's send an update, and we would do that with a patch request. And let's go back to the body because that's what we can change here. And let's change the role to engineer. And let's go ahead and send this. And we got a 404 not found. Why is that? Because we didn't say which user we were updating. We didn't send the ID. So now at this point, let's update user 6. And we don't really need to send the name and the email again, although we could. It will just update all of those. So let's just send the engineer information. Let's try this once again. Send. Now it says it's okay. So here's what we got back. ID, name Dave, email still the same, role engineer. So it only updated what we sent, which was the role of engineer. So once I, of course, formed the request correctly, all was good. Now let's go ahead and delete one. And that would be the delete method over here. We're going to go to users and let's delete user number 3. So we'll send this, and of course that user that we deleted is what is returned from our method. That's fine. But now when we check all users, and we don't want just user 3, which probably isn't there, let's get all the users. Now we've got 1, 2, and it skips to 4, 5, and 6 because we deleted user number 3. Now you could definitely make what we have currently error out, and you could send incorrect information because we're not validating that information as it comes in, and we're also not handling some errors that we could get. We're going to learn all about that in the next tutorial, as well as what I was talking about before. We shouldn't have to keep the types here typed in manually and in the provider as well in our service for users. We should have one source for those. We're going to learn about DTOs also and how that can help us not only have our types, but also with the validation for that information that's coming in, all in the next tutorial. Remember to keep striving for progress over perfection, and a little progress every day will go a very long way. Please give this video a like if it's helped you, and thank you for watching and subscribing. You're helping my channel grow. Have a great day, and let's write more code together very soon.